Hey everybody, welcome back to the salon. So, allow me to briefly expound upon my love of haunted house movies and books. They are pretty much, and I've probably mentioned this before, bar none, my very favorite, my go-to genre of horror. And my list of favorites of haunted house stories, and actually like most of my favorite horror movies in general, are haunted house stories. The Haunting, The Others, The Changeling, The Innocents, The Shining, The Legend of Hell House, all those kind of stuff, like both books and movies. There's just something that's really, I guess, like inherently nasty about the haunted house story. I mean, your house is, kind of like your outer shell. You're supposed to be able to just relax in there. This is a place where you're at your most vulnerable, your most intimate, and you're just kind of like supposed to be safe in there. So when that feeling of safety gets subverted by a haunting, which is like something that you can't control, you don't have any control over it, you kind of feel doubly violated because you have nowhere to go to escape the terror. It's kind of literally invaded the place where you live. So I feel like haunted house media, like whether it's books or movies, when it's done well, it really kind of gives you this sense of claustrophobia, this sense of unease that you can't really match with any other subgenre because, like I said, it's your house, and everybody, like most everybody, can relate to living in a house and having something beyond your control, like invading it, that you can't do anything about. So that's why I think I love the genre so much, and I think that's why a lot of people kind of relate to it, why there's still like haunted house media like still coming out nowadays, even though you would think that it would be kind of like a stale genre. But I think it's absolutely not. They're still entertaining to me, and a lot of them are still very scary to me. So one of my favorite haunted house movies of the 1970s, and one that sort of typifies the house as living entity trope, which you kind of saw in some other films of the period, is 1976's Burnt Offerings. Now, this was directed by Dan Curtis, and he's very well known for lots of different things, but probably best well known for being the creator of the 1960s like vampire soap opera Dark Shadows, as well as the iconic made-for-TV horror films The Night Stalker from 1972 and Trilogy of Terror from 1975, which has Karen Black just like this movie does. Maybe like a lot of horror fans have probably seen the movie, like Burnt Offerings, but maybe what is not as well known is the fact that it is actually based on a classic 1973 novel written by a guy named Robert Marasco. Now, I would consider Burnt Offerings, matter of fact, as one of the, I guess what I would term the big five, like haunted house novels that sometimes get brought up as being among the most influential, I guess, of the 20th century. So the other four would be, and this is probably pretty obvious to any of you that, are into horror at all, the other four would be Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, The Shining by Stephen King, Hell House by Richard Matheson, and The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons. So of those five, though, I've always kind of perceived Burnt Offerings as being maybe the least known and the least read, which is really a shame because it's a great book and easily one of my favorite novels in the haunted house subgenre. Now, it was actually, sadly, out of print for a very long time, but in 2015, Valancourt Books put out an updated edition of it, had a real snazzy cover on it, and I think I have it right here, matter of fact. Yep, there it is. Yeah, look at that. That's like super cool. So yeah, this is the new edition. And and it had, like I said, a cool cover and an introduction by, the award-winning horror, crime, science fiction, experimental fiction author, Stephen Graham Jones. Now, I've actually read Burnt Offerings probably 3 or 4 times, though I came to read it the first time probably back in the mid-1980s, I want to say. Now, I absolutely love, and I've probably brought this up before too, Stephen King's 1981 nonfiction book, Dance Macabre, which is kind of him discussing horror entertainment, books, movies, TV, between 1950 and 1980, and it kind of has some sidetracks going back to the literary origins of the genre, like talking about Dracula and Frankenstein and all that kind of stuff. Now, in the back of that book, he had this massive index of novels and films that he hadn't really gone into too much depth about in the main part of the text, but which he still thought were worth recommending. Like if you were at all into horror from that era, then you needed to see these and read these and whatever. So preteen me, like not too long after reading that book, I decided that one of my goals in life was going to be, I'm going to read as many of these books and see as many of these movies as I could possibly get my hands on So this project, I didn't get to all of them, obviously, because there's a fuck ton of them in there, but it actually consumed like the following few years. And I did actually get like a very large like percentage of the movies and books. Like I did actually get to read them and see them. Now, I'm not sure, like one of those books was Burnt Offerings, and I'm not sure if the book was out of print even back then. I'm talking maybe it was like 84, 85, something like that, because I actually checked my copy out of the library. There was like an old copy in there. Now, by that point, I had already seen the movie, so there weren't too many surprises. The film adaptation is actually one of the most faithful to the source novel that I've ever seen, though because that's kind of like the point of this video, I'll get into the changes that were made in a little bit. So Robert Marasco was a teacher, a playwright, and an author, and Burnt Offerings, as far as I could determine, was his first novel. Now, Burnt Offerings was actually originally written as a screenplay, which was then novelized, and that's probably one of the reasons that the movie follows the book so closely. Now, Marasco had also written a Tony-nominated Broadway play in 1970, which was called Child's Play, which was actually a psychological horror story. It didn't have anything to do with the later film featuring Chucky, although I will say that the play was adapted into a film in 1972, directed by Cindy Lumet, and that is also called Child's Play, but obviously nothing to do with Chucky because that was later. He also wrote another play called Our Sally and another novel in 1979, which was called Parlor Games, but that seems like it was the bulk of his writing output. He did have several unfinished plays, left, like after he unfortunately died from lung cancer in 1998. Now, the first time I saw the 1976 film adaptation was when I was probably about 12 or 13. I think I was in junior high school. Now, I was at a slumber party at this crazy, and you're gonna think I'm making this up, but I'm absolutely not, at this old legit mansion, which was owned by the very wealthy parents of a friend of mine who was named Tanya. Like, her dad was a heart surgeon or something like that, but they had like ass loads of money, and they had this massive mansion. Now, the house was like right out of a movie, and I'm like not even lying. It had one of those big, like, giant sweeping marble staircases, like a big fucking crystal chandelier like in the front room, like back staircases, like secret staircases like that the servants used to use back in the old days. I think the house was built back in the 1910s or 1920s or something like that. Had all these, like, when you went upstairs, there were like all these endless, like, twisting hallways that just went to rooms upon rooms, and it just seemed like there was no end to it. It was just like fucking crazy. It just went on forever. Now, I had never, obviously, my trailer park living has, I had never seen a house like this in real life. I'd only seen it in the movies. I just couldn't believe it. But I will say that this house was probably not the best environment to see Burnt Offerings in. Because as soon as the movie gets to that part where that infamous chauffeur like makes his first appearance, and if you've seen the movie, if you know, you know, I and all the other girls at the slumber party were just freaking out. And we were like scrambling to hide under the blankets on the sofa, or like running into the adjoining bathroom to like jump behind the fucking claw foot tub. You know what I mean? That was fucking, we were terrified. Like I said, it didn't help that the house around us was a little too uncomfortably close to the house that we were seeing on the screen. So as I mentioned, both the book and film versions of Burnt Offerings are very similar. So as I kind of lay out the plot as the video goes on, I'll just kind of detail where the two media differ whenever I get to those relevant points. And it should probably go without saying, although I'm going to say it anyway, this discussion will have spoilers for the end of both the movie and the book. So I'm pretty much going to do the whole thing. So, if you don't want to know what happens, then go watch the movie and or read the book and then come back later on. Final warning. So both the movie and the novel follow the Rolfe family. And this consists of the dad, Ben, who in the movie is played by Oliver Reed, the mom, Marion, who in the movie is played by Karen Black, and their son, David. Now, the son, David, is about 8 in the book, I think, but in the movie, he's more like 11 or 12. And in the movie, he's played by an actor named Lee Montgomery. One of the major differences between the book and the film is in the book's first act. Now, while the movie pretty much jumps right into the Rolfes seeing the ad for, hey, this house is for rent for the summer, and quickly arriving at, the house of horror that is going to like cause them so many problems over the course of the movie. The novel actually spends about the first, I don't know if it's like a whole quarter of the book, but it's a significant portion. The book's not very long. It's only like 220 pages, something like that. So it spends a significant amount of time at the beginning establishing the characters back at their very cramped apartment in Queens, New York. Now, incidentally, that's another difference, although like between the book and the movie, although I think that was this was probably done for budgetary reasons. The mansion in the book is actually on the eastern end of Long Island in New York, while the film is actually, obviously set in California because that's where they shot it and that's where the mansion that they were using to shoot it was. I will also point out that I believe that the mansion used in the movie of Burnt Offerings is the same mansion from the first Phantasm. I think it is like the funeral home, if I'm not mistaken. They've used it in several movies, but those are the two like iconic ones that I can remember. So because the book spends so much time with the family beforehand, and particularly with Marion, we get much more of a sense of her as a character. And this includes the weaknesses that the house is later going to use to exploit her. So Marion is a very aspirational person, and you get a real sense in the book that she's really dissatisfied with her lot in life. She's not unhappy exactly, but it's pretty clear that being a housewife in this tiny apartment in this, dirty, crowded city, 70s New York, with, she has a teacher for a husband, and there's shit like, traffic and pollution, smog, stuff like that. There's an elderly guy who lives in their building who occasionally pees on all the mailboxes. And, this is not really obviously what Marion had in mind for how her future was going to turn out. So she obviously feels as though she deserves better. And that's kind of one of the motivations for why she pushes so hard to rent this summer place, which is, too good to be true. And that turns out to be literal. And why it ends up being so easy for the house to eventually like seduce her into doing its bidding. So another detail that's kind of brought up in the book that sort of speaks to this aspirational nature that she has is the fact that it's brought up that the family usually goes away every summer to this little cabin in upstate New York. But this year, for whatever reason, Marion wants to do something different. And this is the source of some of the conflict between Marion and Ben about renting the mansion. Like, Ben recognizes that the house they rented for vacations before is suddenly no longer good enough for her. So in both the book and the movie, Marion sees an ad for this isolated, very kind of bucolic summer rental that mentions a pool and lakefront access. And the ad also goes on to say that the price is reasonable for the right people. Now, Marion is very excited and she just insists we have to go look at it. And Ben is understandably like very skeptical. Like, what does reasonably priced mean? What does the right people mean? In the book, there's kind of like a lot more back and forth as Ben tries to talk Marion out of this, what he thinks is like a pipe dream too good to be true. And Marion just like eventually complaining and nagging and wheedling until she kind of like, it's kind of like a battle of attrition where she just basically like wears him out so much. So she's like, at least come and look at it. You know what I mean? So he agrees to do that grudgingly, but he's still pretty dead set against renting it and silently kind of hopes, once we get there, maybe there'll be something wrong with it. Maybe it'll already be rented or it'll be a dump or something like that. So then we won't have to, and then I don't have to listen to her complaining anymore. So they drive a couple of hours out of the city, and when they arrive, it's clear it's not just a house that's being rented, but it's an entire estate on several acres. And it has these massive, massive gardens and everything. Now, in both the book and the movie, Ben initially thinks that the reasonable rent is only for the really small, kind of rundown looking gardener's cottage on the grounds, but not the main mansion, which is actually like quite spectacular, but it's kind of like shabby and looks like it needs some TLC and stuff like that. And he's like, there's no way that they're going to rent that to anybody for a reasonable rent. And that's the same from the book and the movie. So Ben is very suspicious and wants the family to just turn around immediately and just forget this whole fucking thing. But Marion just keeps pleading with him, please at least talk to one of the owners, whose name is Roz Allardyce, who Marion has already spoken to over the phone and who is actually like expecting them. So Ben, again, grudgingly, agrees, although when they go up to the house, the first person they meet is actually the groundskeeper, whose name is Walker, who in both the book and the movie is actually kind of like a slovenly pig. So the Rolfs then meet the owners of the house, this weirdly intense brother and sister team. Now, in the movie, they're Arnold and Roz Allardyce, who are played by Burgess Meredith and Eileen Heckart, respectively. Though I don't think, not that I remember anyway, I don't think the brother is ever named in the book, as Roz always just refers to him as brother. I don't think she ever calls him by a name. So the pair are pretty eccentric, to say the least. In the book, they don't necessarily come off as like threatening at first, though the movie obviously kind of makes them seem a little more sinister from the jump, just to fuel the suspense and get the story moving forward. Because like I said, it's a movie and it has to like move much faster. Book has a little more time to breathe. In both the book and the movie, the Allardyces offer the Rolfs the entire 30-room mansion for 2 whole months, from July 1st to Labor Day, for the quite unheard of sum, even back in the 70s, of $900. I think in the book they originally say $700, but then they're like, no, $900. But I think in the movie they just say $900. Now, Ben thinks there has to be a catch, but initially the Allardyces insist there isn't one. And meanwhile, Marion has already become completely enamored with the place. She just oohs and ahs over every single antique and every elegant architectural detail. Now, in the book, they don't really go into this much in the movie, but in the book, her very expensive tastes are made very, very obvious by the fact that she actually recognizes kind of like the provenance of various items in the house. Oh, this highboy was manufactured by so-and-so, and this china has like a really rare, very expensive pattern, like stuff like that. So she's kind of like a brand whore or something like that. Like she just recognizes all this stuff and how expensive and rare it is. And she also feels kind of like an immediate affinity with the house. It's beautiful, but it has lost a lot of its luster. And all of these kind of gorgeous, expensive things are all covered with dust, and the mansion is just slowly falling into rack and ruin. So she feels very strongly that she's the person who is going to be able to restore this place to its former glory. This is essentially the mansion pulling the same stunt as Hill House pulled on Eleanor in Shirley Jackson's novel. It's kind of beguiling the protagonist by making her feel as though she's found her place. And in that way, it's also kind of making her feel very special. So it's sort of using that feeling that she has that she deserves better, like, against her in that sense. So at this point, like, Marion is absolutely resolute. We are doing this. Ben is still trying to back out of it, insisting, look, there has to be a catch. Nobody would rent this massive, massive mansion, even if it is, like, a little bit, under the weather, I guess. No one would do that for $900. So finally, after all this time, like, the Allardyces admit, yes, there is a catch, but it's just a teeny, teeny, tiny, tiny one. What it is that, well, we have this 85-year-old mother, and she's too sick to travel with us to wherever the hell they're vacationing to. So mom is going to stay here in the house with you. But don't get too excited about it. The mother is absolutely no trouble. In fact, you guys will probably never even see her, as she very, very rarely comes out of her room. All Marion would have to do, they tell her, all you have to do is just prepare 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, put them on a tray, and leave them in her sitting room. Just like knock on the door and say, hey, food's here. They're like, literally, that's all you have to do. And it turns out, and I can't remember, I think they did this in the movie too, but like the Allardyces have also left like an entire 2 months worth of food in the house that will easily feed not only their mom, but all of the Rolf family as well. Like, they leave like the whole fucking refrigerator and freezer and the pantry and everything completely stocked. So because of this, Ben is now even more convinced than ever that this is like the worst idea that anyone has ever had in the history of ideas. What if the old woman croaks, like, on their watch? He asks Marion, which is a reasonable question. What if something goes wrong with the house? Will they really be able to keep up with the maintenance on this massive, massive mansion, which is, it's big and it's kind of like in not the best shape? But the Allardyces are like, no worries. The house practically takes care of itself, which, like I said, seems a little sinister. So there's a lot more back and forth in that regard, but eventually Marion gets her way and the Rolfs take over possession of the house on July 1st. So like I said, they're going to be here for vacation for 2 months. Now, coming along on this summer adventure is Ben's delightfully sassy aunt, Elizabeth, who's actually played by Bette Davis in the movie. So from this stage, in both the film and the novel, little things start conspiring to make the house seem like creepier and creepier and more ominous. Marion begins to spend all of her time cleaning and fixing the house up, and she also demands that nobody be allowed into Mother Allardyce's quarters but her. Now, the trays of food that Marion very dutifully leaves for the mother are never eaten, and the old woman never responds to her knocks. Like, she's like, hey, you in there? Like, nobody ever says anything. Now, I will note that the food starts to look like it was partially eaten once Marion starts to suspect that there isn't actually anyone in the room. You know what I mean? So if you know, like, because the house, like I said, is trying to, like, fool her, I guess. So once she starts to think, hey, I don't think there's anybody in here, then they're like, hey, look, somebody's totally eating the food. You know what I mean? And you find out, like, what the fuck is going on with that later on. Now, Marion herself, as the story goes on, also starts to, like, dress more primly, as though she's, like, a much older woman. And she also takes to kind of like mooning around for hours in Mrs. Allardyce's sitting room, listening to this antique music box and kind of staring longingly at the old woman's collection of photographs. Like, she has like a whole bunch of photographs like laid on all these tables. And over the course of the story too, like her hair starts to go gray. In the book, it actually ends up going completely white, like by the end, but mostly it's just kind of like, look, and maybe it does in the movie too, now that I'm thinking about it. Like, yeah, but it goes like gray and then like white toward the end. And then, like, meanwhile, Ben and David, they actually find this old cemetery on the grounds of the house, and all of the graves are Allardyce's, but none of the death dates is more recent than 1890. Ben also finds kind of like little hints that maybe something isn't quite so kosher, like some people have been here before that maybe nothing good happened to. Like, he finds a very mysterious pair of broken glasses at the bottom of the swimming pool. And also, while they're kind of like looking around the grounds, they find this busted tricycle with a bit of blood on it, like, which is kind of stashed in the weeds. So as the tension builds, you know, the weirdness around this house just starts getting weirder. Ben starts having blackouts and he starts acting more violent. At one point, he actually almost rapes his wife, like on the lawn. And then later, in kind of like a big scene, he succumbs to what he thinks of as like an uncontrollable bloodlust while he's horsing around in the pool, like with his son David. And he ends up like this red mist or film like goes over his eyes, and he just feels like he wants to kill the kid. So he just starts like he really wants to drown him. You know, he doesn't in the end, but he really, really wants to kill the kid, and he doesn't know why. He also starts having these really disturbing nightmares, which are described in the book, but given very vivid and terrifying life in the movie. As I mentioned before about the chauffeur, like I said, if you've seen this movie, like the chauffeur, this is like fucking scary as shit. So what happens is, like, the night after he almost drowns his son in the pool, Ben has this dream. And in the movie, it's like filmed in this really spooky, filmy, like black and white. And in the dream, he's like a little boy and he's attending his mom's funeral. And in the dream, there's like this really unsettling figure of like this really tall, lanky, like chauffeur. And he's clad in a black uniform and dark glasses. And he's kind of lurking around the outer edges of the funeral party. And then he's standing by the door of this old fashioned black car and, you know, try and get Ben inside. So Ben gets into the car, and then the chauffeur, his like this really creepy face, like he has this really, really creepy smile, and it kind of like appears in the car window. So this chauffeur, I mean, he's so like creepy looking that I don't know, and I don't think, you know, this is kind of left ambiguous, but you don't know if it was an actual person that Ben remembers from his mom's funeral, which I presume was a real event, or if it's just kind of like a product of his subconscious. Now, as if him having this dream isn't bad enough, there's also a really chilling sequence, and it's really scary, like in the movie, but it happens in the book too. So there's Ben, and he's been like working out in the garden, and he's taking a break. He's kind of sitting on the grass and drinking a beer or whatever, and then suddenly he sees the grill of a car approaching kind of through the trees. Now it's the same old black car from his nightmare, and it just comes very slowly like up the driveway, and Ben is just sitting there watching it, like shaking like a leaf, like he can't fucking believe that he's seeing this thing in reality. So the car stops like several yards away, and the chauffeur's face can just be seen through the car window, just watching Ben with that horrible, horrible, creepy smile. So at this point, like, Ben just like loses his shit, and he just like covers his eyes up. And then when he looks up again, the car is gone. So meanwhile, while Ben is having all those issues, Marion starts to notice that certain things around the house and grounds seem to be regenerating themselves. Now, although she is, again, very dutifully cleaning and maintaining things around the place, or so she thinks, she doesn't remember doing most of the stuff that's occurring. She obviously did not have the time or the wherewithal, for example, to completely repair and like power wash all of the previously cracked and discolored paving stones around the pool, or to, again, for example, refinish sand and refinish all the wood trim like along all the mansion's walls, even though now it looks completely spotless and pristine. Now, she's been having blackouts of her own, actually, without really being consciously aware of it. Though she's convinced that she's been spending hours and hours of time, like, fixing up the place, she's actually been just spacing out in Mrs. Allardyce's sitting room and not really doing jack shit. So what the house in Burnt Offerings is, basically, is the same thing that Hill House is, or the Overlook Hotel from The Shining, or the house next door from the Anne River Siddons novel of the same name. These aren't haunted houses in the sense of being, like, inhabited by ghosts. They are actually what would be termed, I guess, like a hungry house, one that is kind of like a living entity that insinuates its way into the consciousnesses of the people who are staying in it, and it attacks their weaknesses, and it either like lures them into carrying out its wishes and or turns them against one another and then drains their energy or feeds off the conflict in order to kind of like feed itself, restore itself, stuff like that. Now, we actually see this, and, as pertains to the house in Burnt Offerings, this is actually foreshadowed, like, pretty early on in the movie, and I think there's a scene similar to this in the book as well, when the family are still like negotiating with the Allardyces, and Arnold, the brother, is shown like kind of watching sort of like hungrily out the window as David, who's playing outside in the garden, like he falls and cuts his leg. And then like minutes later, one of the dead plants in the greenhouse, because they go in the greenhouse and all the plants are dead, but you see like later on that one of the dead plants has like got this new little like shoot coming out of the pot, you know what I mean? So it's implied that, in both the book and the movie, that the Allardyces actually do this particular rental deal like every so often, every few years. They just sucker in a family for the summer and then leech the life from them in order to keep the house, and by extension themselves, kind of spick and span and possibly immortal, though this isn't explicitly spelled out, although that was the impression that I got. Now, later on in the story, all the windows and doors in David's room close and lock, and then the gas heater somehow turns on and almost kills him. Now, it's insinuated that Anne Elizabeth went in there in a daze and did that, like closed all the doors and windows and then turned the gas on, although she's so confused that she can't remember exactly what happened. Now, Anne Elizabeth herself, when she first gets there, she's real perky and spry. I mean, even though she's in her 70s, she's real, like, youthful and, like, full of life and stuff. But once she gets into the house, she begins to quickly decline from some mysterious ailment, which, again, seems to be, like, draining her. The house is kind of like a psychic vampire type of thing. And she ends up eventually dying. And as she's lying in her deathbed, as a matter of fact, there's another horrifying appearance by the chauffeur from Ben's dream, which is now manifesting in reality, or so it would seem. There's a scene where Ben is sitting with Elizabeth, who's dying, at night, and hears this car pulling up outside, and he creeps over to the window and sees that telltale black car like coming around the drive. He starts like wigging out and like backing away from the window toward Elizabeth's bed, and then both Ben and Elizabeth, who is like nearly incoherent at this point with fear because I think she senses what's going to happen, they start hearing like a noise at the door, like someone's trying to get in. Then there's a close-up of the door, and then like this really loud bang like as the door opens, and then there's that fucking chauffeur like in the doorway, and his with his dark glasses, and he's there with that horrible grin on his face. And then there's like a full-length shot of him standing on the threshold, and there's a shot of Elizabeth screaming, and then like the chauffeur pushes a coffin into the room toward the camera, like implying that he's death, like he's come to like claim her or whatever. And then everything goes black. Now, after Elizabeth dies in the book, her photo actually appears among these dozens of pictures in Mrs. Allardyce's sitting room, which is the thing that causes Marion to realize that the house has actually killed all of the people in the photos, and also causes her to realize that this has been going on for like at least a century, possibly more, because some of the photos look like really old. By this point, though, it seems as though she's too far gone to care, or really like doesn't feel like she wants to do anything about it. I think at this stage, like the hungry essence of the house has pretty much already completely taken her over. Now, in the movie, I think the photos featuring the Rolfs aren't actually shown until the very end, like as a final reveal, like, oh, now they're part of the house's history or whatever, like now that they're all dead. Now, probably the second major difference between the novel and the film is in the third act. Although the ultimate outcome of the story is the same, the way it happens specifically is a little bit different. Now, in both the book and the movie, Ben goes into this kind of like catatonic state after Elizabeth dies, and he sees the chauffeur in that last terrifying appearance, like big as life or whatever. And at one point, he's sitting on the deck while his son David is swimming in the pool. Now, David starts to drown, and Ben is kind of like trapped in place, like he's unable to do anything to help him. And you're led to believe that this is like the house essentially like sealing him inside his own body, because he seems... In the book, you can tell that he's aware of what's going on because it goes like inside his head a little bit, but he literally cannot move. So you're thinking like the house is like doing this to him. Now, here's where the two media diverge some, though. In the movie, Marion sees what's happening from the window of the sitting room and is actually able to kind of snap herself out of this house-induced trance that she's in for long enough to rush down and pull David out of the pool. So she essentially like saves his life. Now, in the book, however, she still absolutely sees her son drowning from a window and sees that her husband is, helpless to do anything about it. And she does actually seem like momentarily terror-stricken, and she does attempt to get out of the house, but all the doors are locked and essentially like impassable, as though the house is like preventing her from going outside and saving him. Now, she eventually does break the door to the terrace, but by this point, it's already too late. She sees the house, she turns around and sees the house like regenerating itself, like right in front of her eyes, and she realizes that her son is dead. Now, she seems to realize that, but she seemed like less upset about it, about her son dying, and actually more upset that the house is like turning on her after she, in her perception, like already gave it everything. Like, I've been taking care of you, and so why would you do this to me, kind of thing. Because like I said, at this point, much like Eleanor in Haunting of Hill House, she thinks the house is her place. This is her house now. And now suddenly, now that the house has gotten what it needed from her, like now it's kind of turning against her, and she's just like, what the fuck, I thought I was special, and all this other kind of stuff. So she seems more upset about that than the death of her son. So we've seen like how far like the house has kind of like drained all of the former Marion out. Now, after this outburst that she has, she actually goes to pound on Mrs. Allardyce's door to like, hey, explain like why you turned against me. And the door actually opens to admit her, like for the first time. And at this point, like I said, it's left very vague in the text, but it seems like this very vast and cosmic force, like a white light that's behind this wall, like completely consumes her and essentially like turns her into Mrs. Allardyce. So she's like been completely taken over at this point. Now, it's not really clear from the book, and I just reread like the third act of it just shortly before doing this video. It's not really clear if Ben dies or if the house just leaves him in the vegetative state as a kind of living death. Because like I said, he seems to be aware of what's going on, but he can't do anything. So he almost has like locked-in syndrome. So I'm guessing that the house just like drained him that way rather than like just killing his body outright. Now, the book actually does go a great deal into Marion's head in the final parts of the story. So we really get a sense of how detached and kind of like cold-blooded she's become. This is sort of like touched on in the movie, but it's a lot less extreme. Marion does start to care less about her family as the film goes on, though she still retains some sense of herself that kind of comes and goes. In the book, though, she goes pretty much like completely heartless and indifferent, like only caring about the house, like what the house needs of her, like why the house isn't treating her like with the respect she feels she deserves. So you begin to understand from the book, like you understand that Marion, as she was, is really no longer in there. She's become like pretty much used up by the force that's animating the house, this force that is disguising itself as this never seen old woman behind this door. Now, I'm not saying that the movie doesn't kill the kid and Ben off, because it absolutely does. Ben actually dies in the movie. After he goes up to the sitting room to get Marion, he's like, we need to get the hell out of this house. But when he sees her in the sitting room, she looks like a freaky old lady, like having essentially become the non-existent person formerly known as Mrs. Allardyce. Like she's got like the white hair and she's all like with the prim clothes and everything like that. Now, it's implied that Marion, Mrs. Allardyce, the Force, whatever you want to call it, throws Ben out of the window, and this causes him to like smash down on the windshield of his own car, which he had pulled up in front of the house to, facilitate their getting the fuck out of Dodge. David, the kid, is already in the car, and he sees his father like splat on the windshield, and understandably upset, like jumps out of the vehicle, at which point like bricks from the house's chimney kind of come raining down on top of him, like crushing him to death. It's almost kind of like the house in its regeneration, it's kind of like casting off like the old bricks and the old roof tiles and stuff like that, so like the new stuff is underneath. So it's like a snake shedding its skin, essentially. Now, I will note that even though the novel and the film are extremely similar, I would recommend both if you like the story of one or the other. This definitely is not a case of if you've seen the movie, you don't have to read the book, which in my opinion is almost never true anyway. Despite the almost identical plot beats between the book and the film, they're actually very different experiences, and they're both absolutely worthwhile, in my humble opinion. The book, as most books do, goes a lot more into the inner lives and the thoughts of the characters, and that gives a lot more context to things that are maybe like only hinted at in the movie. And the movie's strengths are that it's able to kind of like effectively convey a lot of the visual scares that are only described on the page in the book, like such as the chauffeur, which, like I said, is scary in the book, but when you see it, like in the movie, it's actually like much, much scarier. Now, as an interesting sideline, while I was doing research for this video, I noticed that contemporary reviews, from 1976, from when the movie came out, were actually really, really mixed. It seemed like a lot of critics and a lot of filmgoers thought that the ending was too obviously telegraphed. But honestly, I've always, I never really found that, any more than any other movies from this time period. And I've really found kind of like the atmospheric creepiness of the journey of the movie makes up more than enough for any kind of like pedestrian aspects maybe to the plotting or the theme. You also kind of have to take into consideration that a lot of aspects of the film that are kind of like old hat to people nowadays weren't quite the cliches that they are now. And in fact, like some of the themes in the movie were like pretty original, but actually later co-opted, for later films. So it's like if you saw those later films first and then you saw this one, you would think, oh, that's like ripping off that one, but actually like they was kind of like ripping off this one. I also think that the acting in the movie is terrific. Karen Black is always great. Oliver Reed is always great. And I really, really like the interactions too between Oliver Reed and Bette Davis, like as Ben and Elizabeth. They really have like a fun kind of like back and forth, like a kind of like really sarcastic, fun kind of relationship, and I really like that. So, I mean, if you're in the market for kind of a classic slice of 1970s haunted house spookiness, you could certainly do worse than Burnt Offerings. Like I said, it's easily one of my favorite haunted house movies of all time and one of my favorite movies of the 70s. And the book, if you're into that, is likewise fantastic. It's kind of a slow burn. It's very like insidious. The horror is very insidious. And although some things about it, I will admit, are kind of dated, especially the very early 70s, like gender politics, like the way that, the men and women interact and stuff like that, hasn't really aged all that well. But that's just kind of like a minor quibble and like a minor thing. And like I said, that was true of a lot of books from the period. And the book is still a classic, and I would absolutely recommend it, especially if you're into haunted house horror. And like I said, I've maybe seen the movie and either didn't know it was based on a book or want like a little bit of a different angle or like more of an insight into what was going on with the characters that you don't really get in the movie. So that'll do it for this installment. Thanks for dropping by the salon today. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to help this channel grow. And also please go to www.scaresalon.com, where there's a lot more write-ups, book reviews, movie reviews, all kind of different stuff that you can read and enjoy. And I will see you on the next one. Bye.